A widow with 4 starving children. A well that's gone dry. And 5 letters sealed with locks of her own hair. Each one a goodbye to a child she's about to give away. Clara Dawson had nothing left. No water, no money, no hope. Just a debt owned by a man who didn't want her land. He wanted her. And on the night her 12-year-old daughter prayed for the first time since her father died, a stranger appeared on the road. A man with a scar on his throat he gave himself. A man who didn't believe in God. A man running from something far darker than drought. He offered her a job, not charity, not rescue, a choice. And that choice set off a chain of events involving a stampede, a burning camp, an amputation by candlelight, and 3 words spoken by a 4-year-old boy that changed everything. This is not just a love story, this is a survival story. Stay until the end, because the moment that breaks you is the same moment that puts you back together. The lesson. Sometimes the people who save us are just as broken as we are. And that's exactly why they know how to stay. The meaning. This story reminds us that strength isn't about never falling, it's about building something new from the wreckage. That love isn't grand promises, it's mended wheels at 3 a.m. and a bowl of porridge served without being asked. And that the distance between who we were and who we're trying to become is the whole width of a life worth living. If this story moved something inside you, leave a comment telling me which moment hit you the hardest. Share it with someone who needs to hear that starting over is not giving up. It's the bravest thing you'll ever do. And if you haven't already, hit subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss a story like this one. I'll see you in the next one. Clara Mae Dawson had been counting. 43 days without rain, 14 months without a husband. And this morning, when the well bucket struck dry stone for the 3rd time, she stopped counting. There was nothing left to count. She stood at the edge of the well and stared down into the darkness. The smell of baked rock rose from the shaft like breath from a dead man's mouth. She had climbed down twice already this week, pressing her palms against the walls, feeling for moisture, finding only heat. The stone was warm to the touch, even 20 feet below the surface. The last hairline crack that had wept a thin trickle of water 3 days ago had gone dry as bone. This was the end. Not the beginning of the end, not a warning, not a sign of worse to come. This was the thing itself. The well that had sustained her family for 6 years had finally surrendered to the cruelest summer West Texas had ever seen. Mama. Clara did not turn around. She could not let 12-year-old Abigail see the despair in her eyes. The girls saw too much already. Had seen too much for months. Go back inside, Abby. Check on the little ones. I already did. Hank is crying again. He is hungry, Mama. I know. Clara gripped the wooden edge of the well until splinters bit into her palms. The pain felt real. Everything else felt like a nightmare she could not wake from. Inside the cabin, chaos lived in quiet corners. 4-year-old Hank sat in the corner clutching his ragged stuffed bear, the one Daniel had won at a county fair 2 lifetimes ago. The boy had not spoken a word to anyone except Clara and that bear since the morning they buried his father. 7-year-old Rosie was telling Hank a story in a voice bright as brass buttons, mimicking the cheerfulness their father had carried like a lantern. She was imitating what she had lost, and the effort of it showed in the tightness around her small mouth. Abigail stood at the empty stove, mending a dress with thread she had pulled from a flour sack. She did not complain. She did not ask questions. She had stopped asking questions months ago, and that silence from a 12-year-old girl was louder than any scream. Sam was gone. 10 years old, sandy-haired, stubborn-jawed, a copy of his father stamped in smaller clay. He had taken Daniel's Winchester model, 1873, to check the creek bed 2 miles east. The barrel was jammed, had not fired in 2 years. But Sam carried that rifle like a holy relic, the last physical proof that his father had been a man who provided, a man who protected, a man who promised the world, and then died before delivering it. Clara thought of Daniel, his easy laugh, his strong hands, The way he had promised her everything when they ran from Missouri 17 years ago. "We will build something beautiful, Clara May. Just you wait." They had built something. A small homestead, 4 children, a life carved from stubborn Texas soil. And then a horse had kicked Daniel in the chest on a Tuesday morning, and everything beautiful had started dying. The sound of hooves broke through her thoughts. Clara turned to see old Pete Garrett riding up on his mule, a small water barrel strapped behind the saddle, 67 years old, 8 miles in killing heat, to bring her water. She watched him dismount with the careful movements of a man whose bones ached in ways he would never admit. Pete coughed as his boots hit the dirt, a long, rattling cough that bent him double. He turned away from Clara and pressed a handkerchief to his mouth. When he tucked it back into his pocket, Clara did not see the spots of blood on the white cloth. But they were there. "Mrs. Dawson." Pete's voice was gravel in kindness. "Heard your well finally gave up the ghost. Figured you could use this. Mr. Garrett, you should not have ridden all this way in this heat. Probably not." Pete hauled the barrel down with a grunt. "But here I am." He paused, working his hat brim between weathered fingers. "There is something else, Clara, something you need to hear." She waited. "Marcus Webb bought your note from the Fort Worth Bank. Bought it personal. It is not the bank holding your debt no more. It is him, just him. He can call it due whenever he pleases." Clara's blood went cold. The name Marcus Webb moved through her body like poison. She had known this was coming, had felt it the way animals feel a storm before the first cloud appears. Pete stepped closer and lowered his voice. "He does not want the land, Clara. He wants you. Always has." Clara sent him away, not from anger, from fear. Because Pete was right. Marcus Webb had proposed to her in 1865, 3 months before Daniel Dawson walked into her life with dirt under his nails and a smile that rewrote her entire future. She had chosen the cowboy. Webb had never forgiven it. Pete rode east with his mule, coughing into the distance, and Clara stood alone with a barrel of water that might last 3 days, and a debt that would outlast her. That night, after the children fell into restless sleep, Clara sat at the table Daniel had built with his own hands and did the thing she had been preparing herself to do for weeks. She wrote 5 letters. The first was to Reverend Thomas Walker at the First Methodist Church in Riverbend, 15 miles south. She inquired about finding families for 4 children, their ages, their temperaments, their needs. The other 4 letters were personal, 1 for each child. To Abigail, she wrote about strength and grace and the stubborn beauty of refusing to quit. To Sam, she wrote about his father's courage and the difference between anger and purpose. To Rosie, she wrote about joy being a choice and how some people carry the sun inside them. To Hank, she wrote about Mr. Bear and how some friends stay with you forever, even when the people who gave them to you cannot. Then Clara cut a lock of her own hair. She divided it into 4 pieces, each one a thin, dark ribbon. She slipped one into each envelope and sealed them with candle wax. This was not a rash decision. This was a mother who had been dying by inches for 14 months, who had sold everything worth selling, who had exhausted every option and burned through every prayer. This was the mathematics of love. She could not feed them. She could not water them. She could not protect them from Webb. The church in Riverbend could place them with families who had food and wells that worked, and no debt circling like a vulture overhead. It would kill her. But they would live, and that arithmetic was the only kind that mattered. She did not hear Abigail watching from the darkness of the sleeping loft. But the girls saw everything, saw the scissors, saw the hair, saw the envelopes. She knew what goodbye looked like. Abigail did not cry. She climbed down from the loft after her mother finally lay still, walked outside into the breathless Texas night, and looked up at the stars. She had not prayed since the morning they put her father in the ground, had not seen the point. But now, standing barefoot on dirt that had not seen rain in 43 days, she pressed her hands together and whispered to the dark, "If you are real, then send someone, anyone, before morning." The stars burned on. The wind did not answer. And somewhere on a dusty road to the west, a man on horseback who did not believe in God was riding toward the answer to a prayer he did not know had been spoken. Josiah Callahan had seen death often enough to recognize it from a distance, and the woman crumpled in the road ahead with 4 children standing around her like small grave markers in the desert was dying. He pulled his chestnut mare to a halt and studied the scene from 50 yards out. His right hand found the grip of the Colt single-action army on his hip. That was instinct. 10 years of trail work and 8 years before that of war had made caution as natural as breathing. His left hand held the lead rope of a pack horse loaded with supplies for the outfit camped 3 miles west. 5 figures on the road. 1 woman flat on the ground. 4 children standing. The oldest, a girl, had positioned herself between the fallen woman and the road, her thin arms spread wide as if she could shield a whole family with a body that barely cast a shadow. Joe dismounted slowly and walked forward, leading both horses. When he was close enough to see faces, the woman on the ground tried to rise. Her arms shook, her knees buckled. She went back down hard, raising a small cloud of dust. Her eyes found his, and what Joe saw in them was something he had seen in the eyes of soldiers and horses and men gut-shot on the prairie. The look of a creature that had stopped fighting the dying and was now only fighting to finish its last piece of business. "Take my children." The woman's voice was cracked leather left in the sun. "Please, leave me here. Take my babies somewhere safe and leave me." Joe said nothing. He dropped to one knee beside her, opened his canteen, wet a cloth, placed it on her forehead. Then he stood and moved to the children, oldest to youngest. He gave the tall girl a measured swallow of water, then the boy with the jammed rifle in his white-knuckled hands, then the smaller girl with red-rimmed eyes and flowers wilting in her fist. Then the smallest, a boy of maybe 4, who clutched a stuffed bear and stared at Joe with eyes that held no expression at all. He did not say a word through any of this. He gave the water in precise amounts, not too much, not too fast. He had seen men drink too quickly after going dry and bring it all back up. When he returned to the woman, her eyes were open and more focused. The wet cloth had bought her a few minutes of clarity. "Where are you headed?" Joe asked. "Riverbend, the church." "What for?" She did not answer. She did not need to. Joe could see the envelopes in the pocket of her coat. 5 of them. He could see the shape of something thin inside each one. He understood. He had seen this before. Women at the end of everything, preparing to give away the only thing they had left. A long silence sat between them in the heat. Then Joe spoke, and his voice was flat as a planed board. "My cook died 2 weeks back. Dysentery. 42 men been feeding themselves since. About half of them are sicker from their own cooking than they ever were from the trail." The woman blinked. Whatever she had expected from this stranger, this was not it. "I am foreman of a cattle drive moving 500 head north to Kansas," Joe continued. "We need someone who can cook. Pays fair wages. Food and water for you and the children. Protection on the trail. It is honest work." The woman stared at him. "Why should I trust you?" "You should not," Joe said. "You should choose. Walk toward the church or walk toward food. That is arithmetic, not faith." He reached into his saddlebag and pulled out a strip of jerky. He took his knife and cut it into 5 exactly equal pieces, with the precision of a man who had learned that fairness was the only currency worth spending. He gave 1 piece to each child and 1 to the woman. The tall girl ate hers in small, deliberate bites, watching Joe with eyes that missed nothing. The boy with the rifle tore into his like a starving animal, then caught himself and slowed down, ashamed. The little girl ate daintily, as if pretending this was an ordinary meal on an ordinary day. The small boy held his piece in one hand and his bear in the other, and looked at Joe with those empty eyes. Then the boy did something unexpected. He held the bear up, not toward Joe exactly, more like presenting it. An introduction. Here is my bear. This is who I am. This is everything I have left. Joe looked at the bear, looked at the boy, and nodded gravely, the way a man nods when being introduced to someone of importance. The woman watched this exchange and something shifted in her face. Not trust. Not yet. But the absence of refusal, which was close enough. You did not eat, she said to Joe. Already had breakfast. It was a lie. His stomach was a fist. But his face gave nothing away. She would remember this later. Not the lie itself, but what it told her about the man. That he would go hungry and lie about it so that her children could eat. That the lie was a kindness, and the hunger was a choice. And both said more than any promise. They walked toward the camp. Joe led the horses. The two younger children rode the pack horse, the little boy clutching his bear so tight the stitching strained. The woman walked beside Joe, unsteady but upright, refusing his arm when he offered it. Clara studied the man from behind as they walked, the breadth of his shoulders, the dust on his hat, the way he moved with the unhurried economy of a man who had spent decades in the saddle. And then she saw the scar. It started at the base of his throat, where his collar had shifted and ran downward beneath his shirt toward his left shoulder. Not a battle wound, not the ragged work of a blade or a bullet. This scar was too straight, too deliberate. The kind of line a man draws on himself. This man had once wanted to die. And Clara Mae Dawson was walking her 4 children toward his camp, trusting them to his care, following a stranger with self-inflicted scars into the unknown because the alternative was a church in Riverbend and 5 envelopes with locks of hair inside. She almost stopped, almost turned around, almost chose the church. But Hank was sitting on that pack horse holding Mr. Bear, and for the first time in 14 months, the emptiness in his eyes had been replaced by something else. Not happiness, not trust, just attention. The boy was paying attention to the world again, and the thing he was paying attention to was the broad back of a stranger who had looked at his bear like it mattered. That was enough. Clara kept walking. When they were close enough to see the first wisps of campfire smoke on the horizon, Joe stopped. He stood still for a moment, his back to her. Then he turned, and his face held something Clara had not seen there before. Not warmth. Something more costly than warmth. Honesty. Mrs. Dawson, there's something you ought to know before we go in. I ain't a good man. I'm a man trying to become one. There is a difference. Clara did not know how to answer. She looked at this stranger with his scar and his silence and his careful kindness, and she saw someone who understood that the distance between what a person was and what a person was trying to be was the whole width of a life. She followed him in. Captain Ezra Finch had hired and fired more trail cooks than Clara Mae Dawson had years on this earth. He had eaten meals that could kill a man and meals that could bring one back from the dead, and in 30 years of driving cattle from the mesquite flats of South Texas to the railheads of Kansas, he had learned one unshakable truth. An outfit that ate well worked well, and an outfit that ate bad fell apart before the first river crossing. The woman Joe Callahan brought into camp did not look like she could feed herself, much less 42 saddle-worn cowpunchers who burned 5,000 calories a day and considered anything less than 3 hot meals grounds for mutiny. She stood before him in a dress that had been mended so many times the original fabric was more memory than cloth. Her cheekbones pressed against her skin like knuckles inside a glove. Her hair was dull and her eyes were fever bright. And she held herself with the rigid posture of a person who understood that if she allowed her spine to curve even slightly, she might never straighten it again. Behind her stood 4 children in descending order of height. The oldest girl with watchful eyes. A boy clutching a rifle that could not fire. A smaller girl with wildflowers tucked behind her ear. And a silent child with a stuffed bear. Finch studied them the way he studied a herd before buying. Calculating weight, temperament, stamina, risk. Then he looked at Joe, who stood behind the woman with his arms crossed, and his jaw set in that particular way that meant he had made a decision and was prepared to go to war over it. "Joe tells me you need work," Finch said. "Yes, sir. He also tells me you got 4 young ones and no man." Clara felt her spine stiffen further. "My husband died 14 months ago. I have managed since." Managed. Finch's voice was dry as the creek beds that had been failing them all summer. "Woman, you look like you have not eaten in a week. Your children are half-starved and you were walking toward a church to give them away. That does not sound like managing to me." The words fell like stones. Clara heard Abigail's sharp intake of breath behind her. "With respect, Captain," Clara said, and her voice did not waver. "What I was prepared to do and what I wanted to do are 2 different things. A mother does what she must for her children. That does not make her weak." Something shifted in Finch's expression. A flicker of recognition. He had seen that particular brand of stubborn before. In soldiers. In mules. In the kind of people who survive when the world is actively trying to kill them. "No," he said slowly. "It does not." He circled her once, the way he might circle a horse he was considering. 5'6" himself, white beard to his chest, eyes that could cut glass. "You ever cooked for more than a family? I helped my mother feed 30 farmhands during harvest season in Missouri. I was 12 years old. That was 20 years ago. Some things you forget, some things you do not." Finch stopped in front of her and looked her dead in the eye. "I got 42 men on this drive. They work sunup to sundown in heat that would kill a lesser breed. They need food that is hot, filling, and ready when they ride in. Can you do that? Give me a chance and I will show you." 3-day trial," Finch said. "You cook. I watch. My men are satisfied you got a job through Kansas. They are not satisfied. Joe here makes sure you get somewhere safe. Fair. More than fair." Clara turned toward the chuck wagon and took 3 steps before Finch's voice caught her. "One more thing, Mrs. Dawson. I run a clean outfit. Any man bothers you or your young ones, you come to me or Joe immediate. I do not tolerate disrespect toward women or children. Not on my drive, not ever. Not, yes, sir. Then get to work. Supper's in 4 hours and my men are hungry." The chuck wagon was a catastrophe. Clara stood before it and felt something she had not felt in 14 months. Purpose. Flour had been spilled across every surface and left to harden into paste. Dried beans and coffee grounds had been mixed together in what appeared to be either extreme carelessness or an act of sabotage against good taste. A pot of something unidentifiable had been burned to a black crust and abandoned. The whole interior smelled of rancid grease and despair. Clara rolled up her sleeves and began. She was scraping carbon from the inside of a cast-iron Dutch oven when her hand found something unexpected. Tucked behind a loose board at the back of the wagon was a small tin box. Inside the box was a letter. The handwriting was cramped and careful, the letters of a man who did not write often and wanted to get it right. It was addressed to a woman named Margaret, and it spoke of a porch. He had been saving for months, the letter said. By September he would have enough. When he got home from this drive, he would build that porch he had always wanted. The one facing west so they could watch the sunsets. The letter was unsigned. The man who wrote it had died of dysentery 2 weeks ago, somewhere between here and Fort Worth. His wife did not know. His letter had never been sent. Clara held it for a long time. She thought about her own letters, the 5 envelopes in her coat pocket. She thought about how easily her words could have ended up in a tin box behind a loose board, found by a stranger, read by someone who would never know the sound of her voice or the faces of her children. She put the letter in her apron pocket. She would mail it when they reached Kansas. Margaret deserved to know her husband's last thoughts. She deserved that porch, even if it would only ever exist in a dead man's handwriting. Then Clara cooked. She worked for 3 hours with the focused intensity of a woman who understood that this meal was not about food. It was about survival. It was about keeping her children together. It was about proving to a white-bearded trail boss and 42 skeptical cowboys that she was worth the space she occupied in this world. She scraped the burned pots clean. She sorted the salvageable supplies from the ruined ones. She soaked dried beans in hot water instead of cold because that was a trick that saved 4 hours, and her mother had taught it to her when she was barely old enough to reach the stove. She rendered beef tallow into something that could substitute for butter. She built a gravy from broth and cornmeal that could make the toughest trail beef edible. She made biscuits, not fancy biscuits, not Missouri parlor biscuits with real butter and fresh buttermilk. Trail biscuits. Hard on the outside, soft enough on the inside, made from flour that had been salvaged from the mess and cornmeal that was the only grain in reliable supply. She had been making meals from almost nothing for 14 months. This was not a new skill. This was who she had become. As she worked, Abigail appeared at her side. The girl did not ask for instructions. She simply began sorting supplies with the quiet efficiency of someone who had been her mother's right hand for longer than any 12-year-old should. Sam returned from wherever he had been exploring and was immediately put to work hauling clean water from a creek a quarter-mile west. Joe appeared with him, having offered to show the boy the way. When they returned, Sam was carrying 2 full buckets and walking straighter than Clara had seen him walk in months. Something about having a task, something about being useful. Rosie was given charge of Hank. This assignment was presented as the most important job on the entire cattle drive, and Rosie accepted it with the gravity of a general receiving a command. She took her brother's hand and led him to a patch of shade near the wagon, where she proceeded to tell him a story that involved every cow in visible range, each one given a name and a personality, and a detailed biography. The first trouble came in the form of Colt Ramsey. He was 28 years old, rangy and hard, with a face that looked like it had been assembled from spare parts, and a mouth that ran mean as a stepped-on snake. He sauntered up to the chuck wagon with the bow-legged stride of a man who spent more time on horseback than on his own feet, and stopped directly in Clara's path. "Well, well," he said, "what do we have here?" Rosie was crossing behind him carrying a cup of water for Hank. Ramsey turned without looking, and his hip caught the girl square in the chest. She went down hard, the water spilling across the dirt. What happened next happened fast. Sam dropped the firewood he was carrying and launched himself at Ramsey. A 10-year-old boy, 60 pounds soaking wet, throwing himself at a grown man with fists flying. He caught Ramsey once in the stomach, a blow that probably hurt Sam's hand more than it hurt Ramsey's gut. But the sheer shock of it made the cowboy stumble backward. Ramsey's face went dark. His hand came up fast, open-palmed, aimed at the side of Sam's head. It never landed. Joe's hand closed around Ramsey's wrist like a vice. He had moved so fast, Clara had not seen him coming. One moment he was by the water barrel. The next he was between Ramsey and Sam, holding the cowboy's arm in a grip that turned Ramsey's knuckles white. Joe leaned close to Ramsey's ear and said something. His voice was so low that Clara, standing 4 feet away, could not make out a single word. But she saw the effect. Ramsey went pale. The color drained from his face like water from a cracked jug. He pulled his arm free, took 3 steps back, and walked away without another word. Joe turned to Sam. "You all right?" Sam was shaking with adrenaline, his fists still clenched. "I am fine." "Good. Go help your mama." It was the first time anyone besides Clara had called her mama in Sam's presence since Daniel died. The boy blinked. Something complicated moved across his face. Then he picked up the firewood and went back to work. Clara looked at Joe. He met her eyes briefly, then walked away. No explanation. No chest thumping. Just a problem identified, a problem resolved, and a man moving on to the next task. Later, one of the older cowboys, a man named Birch, who had been riding with Finch for 9 seasons, told Clara what Joe had said to Ramsey. He had heard it because the wind had carried the words just far enough. Joe had said, "Next time I will not grab. I will use the knife. And I have killed before, so my hand will not shake." Clara filed this information away. She did not know what to do with it yet. When the supper bell rang, Clara stood by the chuck wagon with her heart beating against her ribs like a bird trapped in a barn. 42 men filed past. They were sunburned and dust-covered and skeptical in the way that men who have eaten bad food for 2 weeks are skeptical of anything served on a plate. The first man through was the older cowboy, Birch. He took a biscuit, beans, and beef in gravy. He raised the biscuit to his mouth and bit. He chewed slowly. His eyes changed. He went back for seconds without saying a word. That was the review. That was the verdict. 42 plates went out, and the ones that came back were clean enough to skip across a creek. No one clapped. No one gave a speech. In the language of men who worked 16-hour days in 100-degree heat, empty plates said everything that needed saying. Joe appeared at Clara's elbow as the last men filed through. "Told you," he said. "It is just biscuits and beans." "No, it is not." She looked at him. He was almost smiling. Almost. It was the closest thing to a smile she had seen on his face, and it lived in the corners of his eyes rather than on his mouth, like a man who had forgotten how the whole mechanism worked and was trying to remember. After supper, after the camp had settled into the low murmur of men digesting and trading lies by firelight, Clara saw Finch call Joe to the edge of the camp. They spoke in voices too low to carry, but Clara watched their silhouettes against the darkening sky. Finch's posture was stiff. Joe's was stiffer. She would learn later, from fragments and implications, the shape of what was said between them. Finch had told Joe, "I know why you are helping her, Josiah. Do not turn my cattle drive into your penance." Joe had replied, "This is not penance." "Then what is it?" Finch had asked. And Joe, after a silence that stretched too long to be comfortable, had said, "I do not know." That night, Clara woke to a sound she could not name at first. A low, rhythmic moaning that rose and fell like wind through a broken wall. She lay still in the dark of the tent Joe had arranged for her and the children, listening. The children slept around her. Hank curled against her side with Mr. Bear crushed between them. The sound came again. Not wind, not cattle. A human voice, tangled in nightmare. Clara rose carefully, stepping over sleeping children, and followed the sound through the dark camp. It led her to Joe's tent. The flap was half open. Inside, Joe lay on his back, drenched in sweat, his right hand gripping the handle of the knife he kept under his saddlebag. His whole body was rigid, every muscle locked in combat with something only he could see. He moaned again, and this time Clara heard words. Not English. A language she did not recognize, one word repeated. It sounded like a name. She stood there in the darkness and watched the man who had saved her children thrashing in the grip of something that had happened long before she existed. Something that lived inside him the way her father's failures lived inside her. Some inherited darkness that no amount of trail miles or good deeds had been able to outrun. Clara realized, with a cold clarity that settled in her stomach like a stone, that the man she had just entrusted her family to was haunted by something worse than drought or debt or a dead husband. She went back to her tent. She did not sleep again that night. They say in West Texas that good news rides a horse and bad news rides the wind. Clara heard the wind before she heard the words. 1 week on the trail, and Clara had found a rhythm that felt almost like living. She woke before dawn. She made coffee first because 42 men who had not had their coffee were 42 weapons pointed at the nearest available target. Then biscuits, then whatever protein the supply allowed. She packed the chuck wagon. She drove it to the next campsite, while the cowboys pushed the herd. She set up. She started supper. She checked on the children. She fell into exhausted sleep. She woke and did it again. The children had adapted faster than she expected, and the speed of their adaptation broke her heart a little because it meant they had learned to survive change the way soldiers learn to survive. By going numb to it, Sam had been assigned to help with the remuda, the herd of spare horses that traveled alongside the cattle. The work was real. The responsibility was genuine. And something in Sam shifted when he was given it. His posture changed, his jaw set differently. The rage that had burned behind his eyes since Daniel's death did not disappear, but it found a channel, a place to go that was not inward. Rosie became the outfit's unofficial mascot. She named every steer she could get close to, and the names stuck. The Cowboys, men who branded and roped and slaughtered cattle for a living, found themselves saying things like, "Go fetch old Buttercup before she wanders into the ravine," and not one of them laughed about it where Rosie could hear. Whatever these men were, they were not cruel to children. Hank still did not speak, but he had begun following Joe around the camp like a small, silent shadow. He did not ask for attention. He did not demand conversation. He simply appeared wherever Joe was and sat down nearby, sometimes within arm's reach, sometimes farther, but always present. Joe did not talk to Hank. This was the remarkable thing. Any other man might have tried to coax words from the boy, might have asked questions or told jokes or performed the kinds of adult theatrics designed to crack open a silent child. Joe did none of this. He let Hank sit. He let him be quiet. He existed beside the boy, without requiring anything in return. And that silence, Clara realized, was exactly what Hank needed. Someone who did not demand words from him. Someone who understood that silence was not absence, but shelter. Abigail had begun keeping a journal. She wrote in it every night by candlelight, and Clara did not read it because a 12-year-old girl deserved at least one private space in a world that had stolen all the others. Clara noticed things about Joe. She noticed because noticing was what she did instead of sleeping. He patrolled the camp perimeter after dark while other men rested. He never accepted a drink when the whiskey bottle passed, and Captain Finch noticed this too and gave a small nod of approval each time as though ticking off a mental checklist. Every morning before dawn, Joe sat alone facing west, toward the Comanche territories, and stared at the horizon with an expression Clara could not read. She noticed that he had fixed the chuck wagon's front wheel sometime between midnight and dawn. She had not asked. She had not mentioned the wobble. He had simply noticed and repaired it while the world slept. The next morning, she made his coffee stronger and hotter than anyone else's, and set it at his usual spot without comment. It was the first conversation they had that required no words. The rider came from the south on the 7th day. He was not one of theirs. A rancher's hand from down near the border, riding a horse that had been pushed hard and not rested properly. He asked for the captain. Finch met him at the edge of camp. Clara watched from the chuck wagon as the man spoke, and Finch's face, which had been carved from stone and weather, and 62 years of hard living, went very still. Finch walked to Clara. He removed his hat. That was how she knew before he opened his mouth. "Mrs. Dawson, Pete Garrett is dead. His ranch burned 3 nights ago." The world contracted to a single point of pain. Clara heard herself ask how. She heard Finch explain that the fire had started in the stable where Pete slept, that the stable door had been barred from the outside with a crossbeam, that this was not an accident, that Pete Garrett, 67 years old, the only person who had helped her for 14 months, had been locked inside a burning building and left to die. Clara did not cry. She walked behind the chuck wagon where no one could see her. She sat down in the dirt. She pressed her hands together until her fingernails dug into the skin of her palms. She squeezed until she broke through. Blood welled up between her fingers, dark and real, and the pain of it was the only thing that kept her from screaming. That was how Joe found her, sitting in the dirt behind the wagon, bleeding from her own hands, her face a mask of something beyond grief. He did not say he was sorry. He sat down beside her on the packed earth. He took her hands. He opened each finger slowly, carefully, the way a man might diffuse something volatile. He wiped the blood with his handkerchief. He wrapped the cuts with a strip of clean cloth from his pocket. Not one word passed between them. It was the first time they had touched, and it was not romance. It was one person sitting with another in the wreckage of an unbearable thing. "Webb," Clara said finally. Her voice was flat as plains. "Webb killed him. You certain?" Pete was the only one who helped me for 14 months. Webb hates anyone who helps me. You know that." Joe was quiet for a long time. The sounds of the camp drifted over the wagon. Men working, cattle lowing, the ordinary business of a world that did not stop for one old man burned alive in his own stable. "What do you want?" Joe asked. "I want Webb dead. That is not what you really want. You do not know what I want. You want your children safe. If Webb dies, another takes his place. If you die chasing revenge, 4 children lose their mother." Clara hated him for being right. She hated the calm certainty in his voice, and the logic of his words, and the fact that he sat there steady as bedrock while her world burned. She hated him because hating him was easier than hating the man who actually deserved it. She pulled her bandaged hands from his grip and went back to work. There was supper to make, 42 men to feed, 4 children to keep alive. Grief was a luxury she could not afford, and so she put it in the same place she had put her grief for Daniel, in a locked room inside her chest where it could howl and beat the walls, and no one would hear. That evening Finch assembled the outfit. He announced they would be taking the long route north, swinging west through open country instead of following the standard trail. He cited cattle fever quarantine zones as the reason. It was a good reason. It was also not the real reason, and Clara knew it, and Finch knew she knew it, and neither of them said a word about it. The real reason was distance. Every mile west was a mile farther from Webb's territory. Finch was adding 2 weeks to his drive, burning money and risking his herd, to put space between Clara and the man who had killed her last friend. He did not explain himself. He did not ask for gratitude. He gave the order and walked back to his tent. That was how decent men operated in the West. They did not announce their decency. They simply spent it, quietly, and moved on. That night, Sam came to Clara. His face was stone, 10 years old and already building the walls that would define him for the rest of his life. "I know Mr. Pete died because of us," the boy said. "Because he helped us. Good people help us and they die. Bad people hurt us and they live. Explain that to me, Mama." Clara looked at her son. She reached for an answer and found nothing. No scripture, no platitude, no comfortable lie that could make sense of Pete Garrett dying in a burning stable because he had dared to bring water to a widow. She could not explain it because there was no explanation. Some questions in the West did not have answers. Some injustices stood unresolved and unredeemed and simply had to be carried. "I cannot explain it," Clara said. "I wish I could, but I cannot." Sam stared at her for a long moment. Then he turned and walked back to his bedroll and lay down with his back to the fire, his father's broken rifle beside him. And Clara knew that something in her son had hardened tonight that would never soften again. She sat alone and listened to the cattle in the wind, and thought about Pete Garrett, who had ridden 8 miles in killing heat to bring water to a woman who could not pay him back, who had coughed blood into his handkerchief and never mentioned it, who was probably dying anyway, slowly, of consumption, who had been killed not by disease, but by a man who could not tolerate kindness aimed in the wrong direction. Somewhere in the dark, a coyote howled. Clara lowered her head and let the sound wash over her like a requiem for the last good man who had tried to help her. She did not know that the next one was sleeping 30 yards away with a knife under his saddlebag and a name on his lips in a language he wished he had never learned. The sound of a bone breaking does not resemble anything Clara had heard before. It was the sound of a dry branch snapping in the dark, clean, decisive, impossible to undo. The storm came without warning. One moment the sky was brass, the next it was black, and the lightning that split it open struck so close to the herd that Clara felt the hair on her arms rise a full second before the thunder broke. 500 longhorns decided simultaneously that the world was ending, and they responded the only way cattle know how. They ran. Stampede was a word that did not do justice to the reality. The ground shook. The sound was a living thing, a roar of hooves and horns and blind animal terror that swallowed every other noise on the plains. Cowboys scrambled for horses. Shouts disappeared into the thunder. The camp, which had been orderly and still moments before, became a chaos of dust and motion and desperate men trying to turn a tide of beef and bone. Clara grabbed her children and pulled them under the chuck wagon. "Stay here. Do not move. Abigail, hold your brothers. Hold Rosie. Do not let go." She could see riders through the dust, silhouettes against lightning flashes, trying to turn the herd. She could hear gunshots, fired into the air, trying to spook the cattle into circling, and then beneath all of it a scream. Not a man's scream, a boy's, young and high and cut short. When the dust settled and the herd had been turned and the rain began to fall in sheets that turned the ground to mud, Clara emerged from beneath the wagon to find a cluster of men gathered around a shape on the ground. Jenkins, 19 years old, the youngest hand on the drive. His horse had gone down in the stampede, rolled, and pinned the boy's right leg beneath 1,200 pounds of panicked animal. The horse had scrambled up and run. Jenkins had not. Clara pushed through the circle of men and looked down. The boy's face was gray. His right leg was bent at an angle that no leg should achieve. And below the knee, where the break had torn through skin and muscle, white bone gleamed in the rain like a piece of the boy's future that had been ripped out and laid bare for everyone to see. Compound fracture. Clara's father's voice echoed in her head from 20 years ago. Bone through the skin means infection. Infection means death. Unless you take the leg. Her father had been drunk when he said that. He had been drunk when he demonstrated it, and the farmer whose leg he had taken had bled to death on the kitchen table because her father's hand had slipped, because the alcohol had turned his surgeon's precision into a butcher's fumble, and 11-year-old Clara had held the lantern and watched the light leave a man's eyes. Now she stood in the rain looking at another ruined leg and hearing her father's voice, and feeling his ghost standing behind her, with a saw in one hand and a bottle in the other. "Nearest town is 3 days' ride," Finch said. His face was grim. "He will not last 3 days," Clara said, and immediately hated herself for knowing it. The boy on the ground heard her. Through the pain, through the shock, through the rain beating on his face, he heard her. And he said the words that no one wanted to hear, and everyone knew were true. "Take it off." He was 19, and his voice broke on the words, but his eyes held steady. "I would rather lose the leg than lose my life." The camp went silent except for the rain. Clara felt every eye on her, felt the weight of what was being asked. She was not a doctor. She was a woman who had helped her father and watched him fail and spent 20 years trying to forget the sound of a saw on bone and the smell of blood and whiskey and the look on a dying man's face when he realized the person trying to save him was the one killing him. Joe appeared. He did not ask Clara if she could do it. He did not tell her she was brave or strong or capable. He looked at the boy and then at her and said 5 words. "I will hold. You cut. If you need to stop, stop. I am not going anywhere." 6 words. Clara counted later. 6 words that changed everything. They moved Jenkins into the supply tent. Finch cleared the space and set lanterns at 4 corners. Clara sent Abigail to keep the younger children away. She did not need her babies hearing what was about to happen. Whiskey for the wound. A leather strap for the boy to bite. Joe positioned himself at Jenkins's head, his hands on the boy's shoulders, steady as iron. Clara looked at the saw in her hand. The blade was clean. She had cleaned it herself, scrubbing with whiskey and boiling water, the way her father had taught her before the drinking took his hands. Her own hands were shaking. She could see the tremor in the steel. Joe reached across Jenkins and gripped Clara's wrist. 1 second. He squeezed, firm, brief, certain, then released. Her hands stopped shaking. She made the cut. She would not remember the details later. Not exactly. Memory in its mercy would blur the worst of it into impressions rather than images. The smell of blood and whiskey, the leather strap tearing between Jenkins' teeth, The boy's screams turning to moans, turning to a silence worse than either. Joe's hands on the boy's shoulders, never moving, never flinching. And the saw. The sound of it finding bone, which was nothing like wood, nothing like anything she had ever cut. A sound that lived in a frequency between nightmare and prayer. When it was done, Jenkins was alive. Unconscious, gray-faced, missing his right leg from the knee down, but alive. Clara had cauterized the wound and stitched the flap of skin over the stump and bandaged it in clean cloth, soaked in whiskey. She walked outside into the rain. She did not vomit. She was harder than that. She stood in the downpour and looked at her hands, which were covered in a boy's blood up to the wrists, and said something so quietly that the rain should have swallowed it. "Forgive me, Daddy." But Joe was standing behind her. He heard. And in that moment he understood something about Clara Mae Dawson that he had not understood before. She carried guilt, too. Not guilt she had caused, but guilt she had inherited. A father's sins passed down like a family Bible, heavy with history and impossible to set down. They were the same kind of broken. That night, Clara could not sleep. She walked out into a camp that had gone quiet with exhaustion and rain. The fire was down to coals, hissing when drops found them. And in the dim orange glow, she saw Joe. He was sitting on a log near the fire, alone, holding something small, a scrap of fabric, pale in the firelight. Clara moved closer. She should not have. It was not her business. But something pulled her forward. The same something that had pulled her off that road and into this man's orbit. And she could not resist it any more than the herd could resist stampeding. She stopped close enough to see. The scrap of fabric was embroidered. A child's hand had stitched a name into the cloth with thread that was once bright and was now faded with years of handling. The letters were crooked, the spacing uneven. The R was backwards. Ruth. Joe did not know she was watching. He lifted the cloth to his face, closed his eyes, held it against his cheek the way a man might hold a hand that had been lost. Then he folded it carefully, the creases worn smooth from 10,000 repetitions, and tucked it into his breast pocket over his heart. Clara returned to her tent. She said nothing. She would never mention the cloth. In the morning, Jenkins's fever broke. Clara brought him water and checked his bandages. The stump was clean, no infection, not yet. They talked. Small things. What a one-legged cowboy might do for work. How a crutch could be fashioned from a mesquite branch. Jenkins was young enough that the shock had not yet arrived, the full weight of what he had lost still hovering above him like a boulder balanced on a cliff edge, waiting for the right quiet moment to fall. Then Jenkins said a name and the ground shifted beneath Clara's feet. "You remind me of somebody," he said. "Girl I knew once, at the home where I grew up. Ruth, her name was. Ruth Callahan. She had eyes like yours, eyes that did not quit." Clara went still. "Callahan." Jenkins blinked. His face changed as he realized what he had said. The last name, the connection, Mrs. Dawson. "There is something I have got to tell you about Ruth. Captain Finch told me something once when he had been drinking, something about how she really died. Joe Callahan did not believe in love. He believed in distance, between himself and other people, between himself and whiskey, between himself and anything that might make him feel. But the distance was shrinking, and he did not know how to stop it. Jenkins told Clara the truth about Ruth Callahan on a morning so still that the grass did not move, and the cattle stood like statues in the early heat, and it took Clara 3 days to decide what to do with the knowledge. This is what Jenkins said, that Captain Finch had hired a Pinkerton detective years ago to find out what really happened to Joe's sister, that the detective had found the truth. That Ruth Callahan had not died of diphtheria as the family had been told. That the relatives who took her in had beaten her. That she had developed a fever after a beating and died. that she was 9 years old, that the orphanage had covered it up, and that Finch, upon learning all of this, had told the detective to write diphtheria in the report, and had buried the truth so deep that only whiskey could dig it up. Finch had let it slip one night when the guilt got heavier than his discipline. Jenkins had been there, too young to fully understand what he had heard, but old enough to remember. Now Clara understood. She understood why Finch watched Joe with that particular combination of love and wariness. She understood the weight behind Finch's warning, "Do not turn my cattle drive into your penance." She understood that Finch had lied to the man he loved like a son, and that the lie had been built from the same material as Clara's mother's silences: kindness, cowardice, love. Cowardice. All three braided together so tightly they could not be separated. She held the truth for 3 days, and it grew heavier with each one. On the first day, she told herself it was not her place to tell Joe. She had known this man for 2 weeks. Who was she to deliver a truth that his own surrogate father had spent years hiding? On the second day, she told herself that the timing was wrong. Joe was distant after Ruth's name had surfaced through Jenkins' casual mention. He sat apart. He stared west. He gripped the fabric in his breast pocket when he thought no one was watching. He was already circling the wound. To open it now would be cruelty. On the third day, she stopped lying to herself. She would tell him because she had grown up in a house full of secrets: her father's drinking, her mother's silence, the pretense that everything was fine while the walls closed in and the bottles multiplied, and the man who was supposed to heal people could not even heal himself. Clara had sworn at 16 years old that she would never build a life on hidden things. And here she was, sitting on a truth that could shatter the only man she had begun to trust since Daniel died. But first, there were things that happened in the space between knowing and telling. 3 days of ordinary life on a cattle drive that was not ordinary at all. Joe fixed the chuck wagon wheel again. It had developed a new wobble, or perhaps it was the same wobble insufficiently repaired. He did it at 3 in the morning while the camp slept. Clara knew because she heard him, the scrape of wood on wood, the tap of a mallet, the quiet curse when a spoke refused to seat properly. In the morning, the wheel was solid and Joe was drinking coffee in his usual spot, and Clara set his cup down hotter and stronger than the rest, and neither of them mentioned it. He taught Sam to throw a lasso. Clara watched from the chuck wagon while pretending not to watch. Joe was patient in ways that surprised her. He did not raise his voice when the rope went wrong. He did not grab the boy's hands to correct his grip. He demonstrated, waited, let Sam fail, demonstrated again. When Sam finally landed his first proper catch on a fence post, Joe put a hand on the boy's shoulder and said 2 words: "Good work." Sam looked up at Joe with an expression that Clara recognized because she had seen it before. On Daniel's face. On her own face in the mirror when she was young, and her father was still sober and the world still made sense. It was the expression of a person who had found something they were searching for and could not name. It was the expression of a child looking for a father. Hank continued his silent attendance at Joe's side. Every evening after supper, the boy appeared and sat down nearby, sometimes within reach, sometimes at a distance. Joe never acknowledged the boy's arrival and never noted his departure. They existed in parallel silence, 2 people sharing the same space without requiring anything from each other. It was the most honest intimacy in the entire camp, and it happened without a single word. From Clara's side, things were shifting too. She caught herself plating food more carefully when Joe was watching, adding a sprig of wild herb to the stew, wiping the rim of his coffee cup with a clean cloth. She was furious with herself for these small performances. They were the behaviors of a woman courting, and she had no right to court anyone. Daniel was 14 months dead. Her hands still remembered the shape of his face in the dark. How dare she garnish a plate for another man? She found Abigail's journal open one evening, left on the tailgate of the chuck wagon where the girl had been writing before supper called her away. Clara should not have read it. She did anyway. The page said, "Mr. Callahan watches Mama the way Papa used to, but he looks away before she sees." Clara closed the journal and put it back exactly where she had found it, and went to scrub pots until her hands were raw. The river crossing came on the fourth day after Pete's death. A creek that should have been ankle-deep had swollen with runoff from storms to the north, and the water ran brown and fast and full of things that did not belong in a creek. Branches, dead animals, the occasional fence post torn from someone's ruined property upstream. The cattle went first, pushed by riders working the flanks. It was difficult but manageable. The longhorns were big enough to keep their footing in chest-deep water, and the experienced steers led the younger ones across. The children were supposed to stay in the wagon. But Rosie, who had been naming the cattle and feeding them grass from her hand and whispering to them like friends, had wandered to the bank to say goodbye to old Buttercup as the steer entered the water. She was standing in shin-deep current, waving, when a passing steer's horn caught the hem of her dress and pulled. Rosie went under so fast that the scream she started never finished. Clara was 40 yards away, too far. She ran, and the distance did not shrink fast enough, and the water was brown, and her daughter was invisible beneath it, and the world had narrowed to a single point of absolute terror. Joe was closer. He did not shout. He did not hesitate. He was off his horse and in the water before the current carried Rosie 10 feet. He went under. The creek swallowed him. 2 seconds. 3. An eternity compressed into a handful of heartbeats. He surfaced with Rosie in his arms. The girl was coughing and crying and alive. Joe carried her to Clara, set her down on solid ground, straightened, walked away without a word, water streaming from his clothes, his hat lost somewhere downstream. Rosie, gasping, eyes wide, said, "Mama, he swims real fast." Clara held her daughter and stared at Joe's retreating back and understood with a clarity that hurt like a physical blow that this man would die for her children. Not might. Would. Without hesitation, without announcement, without expectation of gratitude. He would go into the water, and he would go under the hooves, and he would stand between her babies and anything that tried to take them, and he would do it as automatically as breathing. And that was terrifying, because it meant she might love him. And love, in Clara's experience, was just a more elaborate way to lose someone. That night, the fear won. Clara found Finch by the fire and told him she wanted to leave the outfit at the next town. Take the children to Riverbend, handle things on her own. Finch looked at her over his pipe. His expression was unreadable. "That's so. I have imposed on your generosity long enough, Captain. It is time I stood on my own feet." Your feet were not standing so good when Joe found you on that road. The words stung because they were true. "I am grateful for everything," Clara said. "But I cannot depend on the kindness of strangers forever." Finch puffed his pipe. "We are not strangers anymore, Mrs. Dawson. Or had you not noticed?" She had noticed. That was the problem. She went back to her tent and found Abigail awake, sitting cross-legged on her bedroll with her journal in her lap. The girl's eyes were too knowing for a 12-year-old. They were the eyes of someone who had been watching and listening and assembling the puzzle, while the adults were too busy surviving to see the picture forming. "You are running again, Mama." "I am not running. I am being practical. You are running. But this time you are not running from Mr. Webb. You are running from Mr. Callahan, because you are scared. Abigail, you are scared because he jumped in a river for Rosie. You are scared because Hank follows him around, and that means Hank is starting to love him. You are scared because if we love him and he leaves or dies, we break again. And you do not think we can break again." Clara stared at her daughter. The accuracy of it was devastating. "I am protecting this family," Clara said, and heard how hollow it sounded. "From what?" "From a man who saved your daughter. From a man who feeds Hank breakfast without being asked. That is what you are protecting us from." Silence filled the tent. Then Abigail said something quieter, and her voice changed. The knowing adult disappeared and the 12-year-old returned. And what she said was worse than the confrontation. "I wrote to Mr. Webb, Mama, before we left the homestead. I wrote him a letter begging him to give us more time on the debt. He never wrote back." Clara's heart stopped. "I tried to save us," Abigail said, "and I failed. And I never told you because I was ashamed." Clara looked at this child. Clara looked at Ye. This girl who had been carrying a grown woman's burdens because her mother had been too busy being strong alone to notice. Who had written a letter to a monster and waited for a reply that never came and tucked the failure away inside herself like a stone in her shoe, walking on it daily, saying nothing. Clara pulled her daughter close and held her. No words, just held her. She abandoned the plan to leave, not because Abigail's arguments were right, although they were, but because Clara recognized in her daughter's secret the same pattern she had sworn to break: silence. Secrets carrying the weight alone. Abigail had learned that from her. It ended now. She would tell Joe the truth about Ruth. She would tell him because she refused to build anything, a friendship, a trust, anything at all, on a foundation of hidden things. She had grown up in a house of secrets, and it had nearly killed her. She would not raise her children in one. But first, she had to confront Finch, and the old man would not surrender his secret easily. There are two kinds of truth in the West: the kind that kills quick, and the kind that kills slow. Josiah Callahan was about to receive the second. Clara found Finch at the edge of camp where the grass gave way to bare dirt, and the world opened into a flatness that could drive a person mad if they stared at it long enough. He was smoking his pipe and watching the sunset paint the sky in colors that had no names in English. She stood beside him and said it straight because there was no other way to say it. "You knew. About Ruth. About what really happened to her. And you hid it." Finch did not look at her. He took the pipe from his mouth and held it, and watched the smoke curl upward into the enormous sky. "How did you find out?" he asked. "Jenkins. You told him once when you had been drinking. He did not understand it then. He does now." Finch closed his eyes. When he opened them, the sharpness that usually lived there had been replaced by something old and tired and defeated. "I watched that boy come back from the Comanche Wars with a scar on his throat he gave himself," Finch said. "I watched him drink until he could not stand. I watched him crawl his way back to something resembling a man over 3 years of white-knuckle sobriety that I would not wish on my worst enemy. And you want me to hand him the truth, that his daddy sent his baby sister to people who beat her to death at 9 years old." "It is not your truth to keep," Clara said, "and it is not yours to give." "Then whose is it?" The question hung between them. Finch knew the answer, had known for years. The truth belonged to Joe. It had always belonged to Joe. Finch had stolen it from him out of love, and the theft had cost Joe a decade of false peace built on a lie. "If you tell him and he breaks," Finch said, "that is on your conscience. If I do not tell him and he finds out I knew, that is on my conscience too. I grew up in a house full of secrets, Captain. I will not build another one." Finch looked at her for a long time. Then he knocked his pipe against his boot heel, and the ashes scattered in the wind. "You are a hard woman, Clara Dawson. I am an honest woman. There is a difference." She found Joe at the edge of the horse line, checking cinches before the night watch. She told him straight, the way she knew he needed to hear it. No softening, no preamble, no circling. "Ruth did not die of diphtheria. The family your father sent her to beat her. She got sick after a beating and died. She was 9. Finch found out years ago and hid it from you because he thought the truth would destroy you." Joe's hands stopped moving on the cinch strap. His whole body went still with the particular stillness of a man whose foundations are being removed brick by brick while he is still standing on them. He did not speak. He did not look at her. His jaw worked once, twice. Then his hands finished tightening the cinch with mechanical precision. And he straightened. And he walked away. Not a punch. Not a shout. Not a curse. Just a man walking into the darkness with a truth he could not carry and nowhere to set it down. Clara wanted to follow. Finch appeared at her shoulder and gripped her arm. Let him go. He needs the desert right now, not people. What if he does not come back? He will come back, Finch said, but his eyes were not certain. The longest night. Clara sat by the fire and did not sleep. The hours passed in a silence broken only by cattle and crickets, and the slow creak of the earth turning. She counted the minutes the way she had once counted days without rain, knowing that the counting was useless but unable to stop. Finch sat across the fire, guarding the whiskey supply. He had moved every bottle in camp to a spot beside his bedroll. He did not say why. He did not need to. Joe had been sober for 3 years. 3 years of not touching a drop, of fighting the urge every day, of building a wall between himself and the only thing that had ever made the memories stop. And now the worst memory he did not know he had was loose in his head. And somewhere in the dark, there were 42 men's worth of whiskey waiting to make it go away. 8 hours. Joe returned at dawn. Clara saw him first, a silhouette against the gray eastern sky. He walked like a man who had been in a fight, slow and stiff and hollowed out. His clothes were covered in dust. His knuckles were raw and bloody, the skin torn from hitting rocks or earth, or whatever the desert had offered as a substitute for the things he really wanted to hit. He walked past the fire without looking at Clara or Finch. He walked straight to the tent where Clara's children slept. He stopped at the tent flap, did not go in, just stood there. A man at the edge of something he did not have the right to enter. Inside the tent, Hank woke. The boy always slept light, the way traumatized children do. He saw the shape outside the canvas. He crawled to the flap and pulled it aside and looked up at Joe with those quiet, ancient eyes. And Hank, who had not spoken a word to anyone except his mother, and a stuffed bear since the day his father died 14 months ago, opened his mouth. Please don't leave me. 3 words. A voice so small it barely disturbed the air. A child reaching across the chasm between silence and speech because the need was finally greater than the fear. Joe looked down at the boy. Clara, standing 20 feet away, watched his face. She saw the weight of 10 years, the guilt, the whiskey, the self-destruction, Ruth's embroidered name, the Comanche woman's face in firelight, all of it, every broken thing he carried, shift. Not disappear, never disappear, but shift. Because something heavier had arrived. A 4-year-old boy who needed him to stay. Joe knelt. He picked Hank up. He held the child against his chest and said nothing. And the boy put his head on Joe's shoulder, and the two of them stayed like that while the sun came up, and the camp stirred to life around them. Clara stood behind them and did not speak, because there were no words for what she was watching. Her youngest son, her silent boy, had done what she could not. He had given Joe a reason to stay that was bigger than every reason to leave. But the days that followed were not what she hoped. Joe stayed. He worked. He ate. He tended the horses and scouted the trail, and did everything that needed doing with the mechanical efficiency of a man operating on duty rather than desire. He fed Hank breakfast each morning and let the boy shadow him each evening, and performed every obligation without complaint. But he did not look at Clara. He did not come near the fire when she was there. He did not linger by the chuck wagon, or fix things in the night, or leave any of the small, wordless messages that had been building between them for weeks. He had stayed for Hank, not for her. And the fragile, unnamed thing that had been growing between them was dying. Clara could feel it, the way you feel a fire going out. Not a dramatic death, just a slow cooling, a withdrawal of warmth. She had lost a husband to an accident. Now she was losing another man, not to death, but to truth. And she did not know which was worse. Dust rose from the south before dawn, and Clara knew, the way birds know a storm is coming, that Marcus Webb had run out of patience. 1 week had passed since the truth about Ruth. 7 days of Joe's silence, of Clara cooking meals for a man who would not meet her eyes, of Hank being the only bridge between two people who had begun to matter to each other, and were now separated by a grief that had no remedy. Webb arrived with 6 men on a Tuesday morning. He rode a black stallion that was too fine for the trail, its coat brushed to a shine that spoke of vanity even in the wilderness. His suit was clean, his boots were polished, his gold watch chain caught the sun. But he did not come with guns drawn. He came with paper. He dismounted at the edge of camp and held up a folded document with the calm authority of a man who has learned that law is a more effective weapon than lead. Mrs. Dawson, I have a foreclosure order from the county court. Your debt is 6 months in default. The land is legally mine. Clara came out of the chuck wagon, wiping her hands on her apron. She looked at Webb standing there in his fine clothes with his legal paper and his 6 men, and she felt a strange calm settle over her. She walked toward him, and she did something that no one expected. She stepped in front of Joe, not behind him, in front of him, between the man who haunted her past and the man who was haunting her present. You want to talk, she said. You talk to me. This man has got nothing to do with your business. Joe, standing behind her, felt something shift in a place he had locked shut a week ago. Clara was not hiding behind him. She was standing between him and danger, not because he was weak, because she was declaring that this fight was hers. Webb's eyes moved from Clara to Joe and back. I see you found yourself another cowboy, Clara, after everything. Take the land, Clara said. The words came out steady. Take it. I do not care anymore. My children are fed. They are safe. They are together. That is worth more than dirt. I do not want the land, Clara. Webb's voice changed. The practiced calm cracked, and what lived underneath was not cruelty. It was hunger, 17 years of it. The starving need of a man who had wanted one thing for nearly 2 decades and had convinced himself that persistence was the same as virtue. I want you to understand that you need me, Webb said. I have waited 17 years. I bought your debt, I held off the bank, I gave you time, and you chose to run away with a drifter instead of coming to me. I needed someone for 14 months, Clara said. You sent no food, no water. You bought my debt and waited for me to crawl. That is not love, Marcus. That is not even patience. That is a trap. Webb stepped closer, his composure shattered. Daniel was nothing. A broke cowboy with dirt under his nails. You chose him over me, and he died. He left you with nothing. I would have given you everything. Clara did not step back. He gave me 4 children and 10 good years. That is more than everything. That is enough. Webb stared at her. For one moment, the mask was gone entirely, and Clara saw the 17-year-old wound underneath, raw and festering, a rejection that had calcified into obsession. Then the mask slid back into place, and the banker returned. I will be back, Clara, with more paper and more law. Your cowboy cannot protect you from a court order. He mounted his horse and rode south with his 6 men and his legal paper, and the dust swallowed him the way the desert swallows everything eventually. The camp was quiet after Webb left. Cowboys went back to work with the deliberate busyness of men pretending they had not just witnessed something private and terrible. Clara stood where she was, breathing hard, the adrenaline draining from her body and leaving her hollow. Joe stood behind her. For a long time, neither spoke. The silence between them had changed. It was no longer the cold silence of distance. It was the charged silence of things that needed saying. Joe spoke first. I need to tell you something. About me. About what I did in the war. Before you decide whether I am worth standing in front of, you do not owe me that. I owe it to myself. Sit down. She sat. And Joe did not narrate. He did not deliver a speech or a monologue or a confession wrapped in explanations. What he gave her was fragments, pieces, the way memory actually works when the memory is too terrible for narrative. Smoke. He said smoke. Screaming. An officer saying, burn it. Joe saying, sir, there are women in there. The officer saying, I said, burn it. Then running. A woman coming out of a tent with a child on her hip, 3 years old maybe. Joe's rifle up, his hands shaking. She was running toward him and he was afraid. The gun fired, the woman folded. The child fell with her, did not cry, just stopped. Then silence. Joe standing over two bodies, smoke everywhere. The officer walking past saying, "Good work, soldier." Joe's voice was raw as a wound when he finished. His eyes were somewhere else, somewhere 8 years ago on a burning plane. "I did not shoot because of orders," he said. "I shot because I was scared. She was running at me and I was a coward. A 3-year-old child died because a grown man was afraid." The silence that followed was the loudest thing Clara had ever heard. She did not reach for him. She did not comfort him. She sat with the truth the way he had sat with hers when Pete died, present, not performing. "You want me to say I forgive you," Clara said. "No. Good. Because that is not mine to give. What happened to that woman and her child? Only God or they can forgive that, not me." She paused. "But the man standing in front of me right now is not the man who pulled that trigger. If you believe that, stay. If you do not, go." Joe did not answer. He stood and walked away. And Clara sat alone by the fire and wondered if she had just made the best or worst decision of her life. In the morning, she woke to find the chuck wagon wheel had been repaired. Firewood had been split and stacked beside the cook fire, and Joe was sitting by the coals, feeding Hank a bowl of porridge, the boy leaning against Joe's leg, Mr. Bear propped on the ground beside them. He stayed, not with words, with a wheel and firewood and a bowl of food for a child who had once been silent and was now slowly learning to trust the world again. Clara understood finally that this was how Josiah Callahan said everything he could not speak aloud. Not in words, but in mended wheels and split wood, and the patient attention paid to a 4-year-old boy. This was his language. And if she wanted to hear him, she had to learn to listen differently. Joe always knew Marcus Webb would come back. He did not expect him to come back alone, in the dark, unarmed, and telling the truth for the first time in 17 years. 2 in the morning. Joe was on night watch, riding the perimeter, listening to the cattle breathe and the grass whisper. A single rider appeared from the south. 1 horse, 1 man, no escort. Joe drew the colt and waited. The rider stopped 20 yards out, dismounted slowly, hands visible. "I am not here to fight, Callahan." Joe knew the voice. He did not lower the gun. Webb walked forward until the moonlight caught his face. He was not the man Clara had confronted a week ago. He was unwashed, unshaven. His fine suit was wrinkled and stained. His eyes had the hollowed look of a person who has not slept in days. "I am here to talk to her. She does not want to talk to you. I know that." Webb's voice cracked. He pressed his hands to his face, and when he lowered them, the mask was gone entirely. Not the practiced removal of a performance, the genuine collapse of a man who had finally run out of the energy required to pretend. "I have been waiting 17 years, Callahan. I bought her debt. I pressured her neighbors. I did everything wrong, every single thing. But I did it because I thought if she lost everything else, she would finally see me. See that I was the answer." His voice changed. Raw, genuine, ugly in a way that had no artifice in it. "I was wrong. I know I was wrong. I came here to tell her that. And to tell her the land papers, I will tear them up. She can have the homestead back. I just needed her to know it was never about the land. It was never about the money. It was about me not being able to let go of something that was never mine." Joe studied the man in the moonlight and saw something he recognized. A human being destroyed by something he could not release. Joe knew that shape. He had worn it himself for 10 years. He carried it still. The Comanche woman's face. Ruth's backwards R. The bottle that whispered promises in the dark. Webb was not a monster. He was a man whose love had curdled into something monstrous. And there was a difference. And Joe understood the difference because he lived it every day. Before Joe could respond, the night exploded. Gunshots came from the east side of camp, then fire. The chuck wagon erupted in flames so fast that Joe knew accelerant had been used. Coal oil, splashed and lit. "What the hell?" Webb gasped. He spun toward the fire. I did not. This was not. Riders, 6 of them, coming hard from the east in a scattered formation that spoke of violence rather than strategy. Joe recognized the pattern. These were not soldiers or lawmen. These were men who had been promised money and had not received it, and they were here to collect by force. Webb's hired guns from weeks ago, the ones he had sent to intimidate Clara, and never paid. They had followed Webb north. They had waited until he was alone in enemy territory. And now they were here to take what they were owed in cattle and supplies and whatever else they could grab from a camp caught sleeping. Webb had set a machine in motion weeks ago, and the machine had kept running after he tried to stop it. The consequences of his own actions had circled back and found him. "No," Webb said again, his voice cracking with genuine horror. "No. I told them to stand down. I told them it was over." But words, once the violence they inspired had been set loose, did not come back. Any more than bullets did, any more than the truth about Ruth did. The camp erupted. Cowboys scrambled from bedrolls, rifles cracked. The cattle, spooked by gunfire and flames, began to shift and bellow. Joe ran. He ran toward Clara's tent, because that was the only direction his body knew. Behind him, Webb stood frozen in the moonlight, watching his worst intentions burn. In the chaos, 2 of the hired men had breached the inner camp. They were heading for the supply wagons when they passed Clara's tent. Sam was there, 10 years old, standing in front of the tent flap with his father's broken Winchester in his hands. The rifle that could not fire. The rifle that was sacred because it was the last thing his father had touched. One of the hired men saw the boy and laughed. Sam did not try to shoot. He knew the rifle would not fire. He had known for 2 years. But a weapon that cannot shoot can still be swung. And Samuel David Dawson, 10 years old, full of rage and grief, and 14 months of unanswered prayers, drove the butt of his father's Winchester into the man's kneecap with every ounce of fury he possessed. The man went down screaming. Sam hit again. And again. He hit because Pete Garrett was dead and his father was dead, and good people kept dying while bad people kept coming, and the only answer he had was a broken rifle in 2 hands, and the refusal to let one more bad thing happen to the people he loved. Abigail pulled him off. The 12-year-old girl wrapped her arms around her brother from behind and dragged him backward. And Sam's swings went wild and then stopped, and the boy looked down at his hands. They were covered in blood, not his. He began to shake. The adrenaline drained, the fury collapsed. And what was left was a 10-year-old boy who had just beaten a man half to death and was discovering what violence actually felt like on the other side of the red haze. Across the camp, Colt Ramsey, who had spent his whole life despising weakness and women and anything that smelled of sentiment, ran through fire. The chuck wagon was fully engulfed. The flames had spread to the canvas of the nearest tent. Rosie and Hank were inside that tent, separated from Clara by the fire. Ramsey did not calculate odds or weigh options. He went through the flames with his arms wrapped around his own head, and emerged on the other side, singed and coughing and alive. He scooped Rosie under one arm and Hank under the other and ran back through the fire and delivered them to Clara. He did not do it for Clara. He did it because they were children, and he had once been a child no one came back for. And whatever darkness lived in Colt Ramsey, it did not extend to leaving small ones in a burning tent. Clara had just taken her children from Ramsey's arms when the burning timber fell. She was pulling Abigail away from the wagon. The main crossbeam, weakened by fire, let go and swung down like a pendulum. It caught Clara across the left shoulder and the side of her head with a sound like God clapping his hands. She went down. Joe found her. He was bleeding from a knife wound in his right side, taken in a fight with the first hired man to enter the camp. He did not know he was bleeding. The blood was warm on his shirt and he could feel it, but it did not register because the only thing his eyes could see was Clara on the ground, motionless, blood on her face, blood in her hair, blood on the dirt beneath her head. Josiah Callahan, who had not cried since the day he learned Ruth was dead, who had locked every feeling behind iron walls for 10 years, who communicated in firewood and fixed wheels because words were the one tool he had never learned to use, dropped to his knees beside Clara Mae Dawson. He took her hand, and he said the words, "Please don't leave me, Clara. Please don't leave me." The toughest man on the drive, the veteran of wars and stampedes and a decade of silent atonement, was on his knees in the dirt, begging. Not for himself. For the first time in his life. Not for himself. Finch arrived. Assessed the scene with the cold eye of a man who had managed crises for 30 years. "She is alive, Josiah. But you will not be if you do not stop that bleeding. Let me tend to her." Joe would not release her hand. Finch had to order Ramsey to hold Joe back, and Joe fought. And it took Ramsey and 2 other cowboys to keep him down while Finch knelt beside Clara and checked her pulse and her breathing and her eyes. "She is alive," Finch said again. "Broken shoulder, concussion, but alive." Joe stopped fighting. He lay on his back in the dirt beside Clara, his own blood pooling beneath him. And he held her hand, and he did not let go even when consciousness began to fade. Clara woke to pain and gray light and the smell of smoke. Her left shoulder was a mass of fire. Her head throbbed with every heartbeat. She was lying on a bedroll in a tent she did not recognize, and the first thing she saw when she opened her eyes was Joe. He was beside her, also on a bedroll, also bandaged. His face was gray and his shirt was dark with blood, and his hand was wrapped around hers so tightly that she could not tell where his fingers ended and hers began. He was unconscious, or asleep, she could not tell. She could not. But his grip on her hand was absolute, and sitting between them, cross-legged, hands on her knees, was Abigail, 12 years old. Eyes red-rimmed but steady. A basin of clean water beside her and strips of bandage in her lap. The girl had been tending to them both while they slept, changing bandages, wiping blood, doing what her mother had taught her without being asked. "The children," Clara whispered. "All safe," Abigail said. "Ramsey got Rosie and Hank out. Sam is—" she paused. "Sam is shaken, but he is whole. Webb. The cowboys have him tied to a wagon wheel. Finch sent riders for the county sheriff." Clara closed her eyes. The pain crashed over her in waves. But beneath the pain, beneath the smoke and the fear and the ruin, she could feel Joe's hand in hers. Warm, present, holding on. She held on back. The district judge in Caldwell needed 11 minutes to convict Marcus Webb on charges of conspiracy to commit arson, accessory to assault, and criminal extortion. Clara thought 11 minutes was a small thing for 17 years of obsession. But justice in the West was never enough. It was only ever just enough to let a body move on. Webb was sentenced to 12 years in the Kansas State Penitentiary at Lansing. Not for forged documents. The debt had been real. The default had been real. The land was gone, lawfully and permanently, and no court ruling would change that. Webb went to prison for the violence. For Pete Garrett's burned stable with its cross-beam barred from outside. For the hired men who had attacked the cattle camp. For the chain of destruction that a man's obsession had set in motion and could not recall. The sheriff led Webb out in irons. He passed Clara on the courthouse steps. The sheriff let him stop. "I would have given you everything, Clara," Webb said. Clara looked at the man she had feared for 14 months. The man who had killed her friend and terrorized her family and chased her across Texas with law and fire and hired guns. She looked at him and did not see a monster. She saw a man who had spent 17 years building a prison of his own obsession and had finally been given walls to match it. "I know," she said. "That was the problem. Webb was led away." Clara watched him go and felt not satisfaction, not relief, but a weariness so deep it seemed to have roots in the earth itself. And beneath the weariness, a hollow ache for the 17-year-old girl in Missouri who had turned down a banker's son for a cowboy with dirt under his nails and would do it again every time. The homestead Daniel had built was gone. The well, the cabin, the fence posts, the table he had made with his own hands. All of it. Gone to a piece of paper with a judge's stamp and a banker's signature. This was the loss Clara carried out of that courtroom, and it was real, and it was permanent, and no one was coming to undo it. The herd reached Dodge City on a Thursday afternoon in late August. 500 longhorns delivered to the buyers' pens in a cloud of dust that turned the sunset red. Captain Finch shook hands with a man in a bowler hat and received a bank draft, and the drive was over. Finch found Clara by the chuck wagon. He held out a pouch of coins. "Your pay, Mrs. Dawson. Full wages. Same as any man on this drive." Clara tried to refuse. "You will take it," Finch said, and his voice was iron wrapped in gravel. "You earned every cent. Do not let pride rob your children of what is rightfully theirs." She took the pouch. It was not heavy. It was not a fortune, but it was honest pay for honest work, and it was hers. Finch looked at her for a long moment, and behind the glass-cutter eyes and the white beard and the 30 years of trail dust, Clara saw something she had not seen there before. Tenderness, carefully hidden, fiercely guarded. But there. "Live well," he said. "Raise those young ones right. That is thanks enough." He turned to Joe, and the tenderness disappeared, replaced by something closer to a father's exasperation with a son who will not sit still. "Stop running, Josiah. Stop atoning. Start living." Joe nodded. Words were unnecessary between them. They had said everything that needed saying in decades of shared silence and shared trails, and one terrible lie told out of love. Finch walked away without looking back. Clara suspected he would not have wanted them to see his face. Jenkins hobbled over on a crutch carved from a mesquite branch. 19 years old, one-legged, grinning. "Mrs. Dawson, you took my leg. Way I figure, you owe me a roof." He was half joking, half not. He had no family, no prospects. Nowhere to go when the drive ended except the next saloon or the next outfit that would take a one-legged hand, which was none. Clara looked at Joe. Joe shrugged. "Could use the help. Rebuilding is hard work." Jenkins nodded so hard his crutch nearly slipped. "You will not regret it. I swear you will not." Ramsey was last. He could not meet Clara's eyes. He walked to the chuck wagon and set something down on the tailgate and turned to leave. "Mr. Ramsey." He stopped, did not turn. "Thank you," Clara said. "For my children." Ramsey stood there a moment, then he walked away without a word. Clara looked at what he had left, a bundle of wild herbs tied with a leather string, and tucked inside one small wildflower. A prairie rose, barely blooming, as out of place on a chuck wagon as tenderness in a man who had spent his whole life pretending he had none. It was an apology. It was enough. Sam shook every cowboy's hand as they left. Each one. The men who had taught him to rope. The men who had eaten his mother's biscuits and told him stories by the fire. The men who had fought to protect a family that was not theirs, because Finch had said these people are ours now, and they had believed him. Sam was not a man yet, but he was no longer just an angry child. Somewhere between the first day on the trail and this last one, between his father's broken rifle and the blood on his hands in the firelight, he had crossed into a territory that had no name, but everyone recognized. He stood straighter, and the Winchester was nowhere in sight. He did not need it anymore. Joe led Clara to the edge of town. It was the first time they had been truly alone since the night he told her about the Comanche woman and the child. Dodge City spread before them, new buildings going up, streets full of wagons and horses and people chasing the same dream in different directions, the smell of sawdust and manure and possibility. "I lost the land," Clara said, "lost the house, lost everything Daniel built. What have you got left? 4 children, a cowboy with a knife wound who will not sit still, and a one-legged boy who will not go away." Joe almost smiled. "That sounds like enough to start." "Start where? Dodge City is growing. Needs people. Needs a cookhouse. Trail hands need a place to eat that will not poison them." Clara looked at him. He was not proposing marriage. He was not declaring love. He was doing what he had always done, offering a practical solution to an immediate problem, arithmetic, not faith. But beneath the practicality, she could hear what he was really saying, the way she had learned to hear him over weeks of mended wheels and split firewood and bowls of porridge served without being asked. He was asking her to stop running, same thing she had asked him. "You are asking me to open a restaurant," she said. "I am asking you to stop running, same thing you asked me." They stood together and looked at the town and the sky and the future that was uncertain and difficult and completely without guarantees. And then Joe turned to Hank, who was sitting nearby on a fence rail with Mr. Bear in his lap. "Mr. Bear," Joe said, and his voice changed. The stoic flatness cracked, and beneath it was something raw and terrified and human. "Tell your mama that I'm not going anywhere. Tell her that I—" He stopped, swallowed. The words were the hardest thing he had ever said. Harder than the confession about the Comanche woman. Harder than the truth about Ruth. Because those truths had been about what he had done. This one was about what he felt. And Josiah Callahan had spent 38 years building walls against feeling. "Tell her I love her. Can you do that?" Hank looked at Joe, looked at Clara, lifted Mr. Bear with the solemnity of a priest raising a chalice, and said in his small, serious voice that had been silent for 14 months, and was still learning how to carry weight, "Mr. Bear says Mr. Joe loves Mama." Clara laughed. It was not a polite laugh, or a brave laugh, or a laugh performed for anyone's benefit. It was a laugh that started in her belly and broke across her face like sunrise breaking across a prairie. A laugh that cracked open every locked room in her chest and let the daylight in. Joe heard it, and the last wall fell. The building was small. 4 walls and a roof on Dodge City's front street. Nothing special, nothing fine. The door hung slightly crooked and the floorboards creaked, and the window glass had a ripple in it that made the street outside look like it was underwater. But on the table inside sat a cast-iron pot, a sack of flour, a salt crock, and a jar of the wild herbs Ramsey had left on the chuck wagon. And outside, Jenkins was carving a sign from a plank of fresh-cut pine with the careful attention of a man who understood that names matter. Dawson and Callahan. Clara looked at the sign. Dawson first. "It was your ranch," Joe said. "There is no ranch anymore. This is something new. Then Dawson first, because you got here first. I'm just following." Clara picked up the sign and a hammer and a nail and climbed the stepladder that leaned against the front of the building. Joe moved to the base of the ladder and held it. Not because she was weak, because the ladder was old and the ground was uneven. And he was a man who fixed things. That was what he did. That was who he was. She drove the nail. The sign bit into the wood of the building and held. Dawson and Callahan. A new name for a new life built from the ashes of 2 old ones. Clara looked down from the ladder. Below her, the world arranged itself like a painting she had not known she was composing. Sam was tying a horse to the rail out front, his hands sure on the knots, his back straight. Rosie was drawing flowers on the porch step with a piece of chalk, narrating a story to no one in particular about a cow named Buttercup, who had crossed a river and found a field of clover on the other side. Jenkins sat on a stool by the door teaching Hank to braid rope, one-legged and patient, his hands quick despite everything he had lost. Abigail was on the doorstep, her journal on her knees, writing. And Joe was looking up at her. The afternoon sun was behind Clara's back. Joe could see only her silhouette against the light. A figure outlined in gold standing above him, just like the first time he had seen her. On a dusty road, a shape against the sun. 5 figures, 1 woman falling, 4 children standing, but this time she was not falling. She was standing. Standing on a ladder she had climbed herself, holding a hammer she had swung herself, beneath a sign that bore her name first. Clara looked down at Joe and smiled. Not the brave smile she had worn like armor for 14 months. Not the performing smile she used to reassure her children. A real smile. The kind that happens when a person has stopped surviving and started living. Joe smiled back, and his smile was rare and almost shy, the smile of a man who had forgotten the mechanism and was slowly remembering how it worked. Clara stepped down from the ladder. Joe offered his hand, not because she needed it, because he wanted to. She took it. Her feet touched the ground. She did not let go. Years later, when people asked Clara May Callahan where she started over, she always gave the same answer. On a dusty road, she would say, with a man who had a scar, and 3 words my youngest boy said to him at dawn. She never explained what those 3 words were. She did not need to. Anyone who watched the Callahans live, loud and messy and dust-covered and stubbornly refusing to quit, understood well enough. The sign above the door read Dawson and Callahan. It weathered and faded and was repainted twice and replaced once. The building grew. A second room, then a third. Then a proper kitchen that could feed 50 trail hands and a porch facing west where Clara and Joe sat in the evenings and watched the sun go down. Hank learned to talk. Then he learned to talk too much. Mr. Bear sat on a shelf above his bed until the stuffing came out, and then Clara stitched him back together the way she had stitched together everything else in her life. With steady hands and strong thread, and the stubborn refusal to let anything she loved fall apart. Sam grew tall. The anger never fully left him, but it found channels. Hard work, fair dealing, a protective ferocity toward anyone weaker than himself that made people think twice before starting trouble in his presence. Rosie named everything: horses, dogs, the chickens that scratched in the yard, the stray cat that Jenkins adopted and pretended he had not. Abigail kept writing. Her journal became journals, plural, filling a shelf in the room she shared with Rosie. She wrote down everything: the cattle drive, the fire, the night her brother broke his silence, the morning her mother climbed a ladder and hung a sign. And Jenkins, one-legged and grinning, stayed. He carved signs and mended harness and told anyone who would listen the story of the woman who took his leg and gave him a family. Joe never did say "I love you" again. Not in words. He said it in mended fences and early mornings, and the way he stood between his family and the world without being asked. And Clara, who had once counted days without rain and months without a husband, and believed that counting was all she had left, stopped counting entirely. There was nothing left to count. There was only everything left to build. And they built it together. This content was carefully researched, developed, and manually edited by our team to deliver meaningful stories with valuable life lessons. Every narrative is crafted to entertain, inspire, and empower our audience. Thank you for being part of our community.